Life in a small town can mean many things. Among them, they're usually places that foster a sense of community. Everyone knows one another, and people normally go above and beyond to help anyone in need. One of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history comes from one of these small towns. A town that had so much potential and was a true up-and-comer in the early 1900s had a shadow cast over it on one fateful night in June, when a family was murdered as they slept, and to this day, the perpetrator of the murders has never been caught. Was it a person with a personal vendetta, or living out some sick fantasy? Or was this something much worse? On this week's episode, we'll travel to Iowa and examine the story surrounding the Villisca Axe Murders. Hello everyone, and welcome back for another chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on this week's episode, we're going to explore the famous unsolved murder case commonly referred to as the Villisca Axe Murders. Ensure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn out your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Maybe you're alone, but maybe you're not. Now, follow the sound of my voice as we travel back to 1912 and Villisca, Iowa for an episode that is part true crime and modern day paranormal. The quiet Midwestern town of Villisca is located in Montgomery County, Iowa. Since the early 1900s, the town of Villisca has declined greatly. In 2019, the town recorded a population of only 1,100 people, a far cry from where it was just 100 years before. Having once been referred to as the greatest town in the state, in 1912, the town had a population of around 2,500. It was a beacon for economic development. There was a great boom for local businesses brought on by wealthy people coming into the area due to its potential. The quietness and quaintness of the town would only be disturbed by the trains that ran through the area. Villisca was also home to a National Guard armory funded by the residents and was the first of its kind. The town seems truly idyllic, but that visage would be shattered in June of 1912 when the Moore family were murdered in their home on the night of the 10th of June. The Moore family patriarch was a man by the name Josiah B. Moore, or more commonly referred to as JB. JB was a well-known and very respected businessman in the town, and he had a penchant for being able to excel at every vocation he tried. He had accumulated a respectable amount of wealth in his 30s and would marry his wife, Sarah Montgomery, on the 6th of December, 1899, in their parents' home. Together, JB and Sarah would have 4 children: Herman, who was 11, Mary, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5. The Moore family was well known throughout the town for their generosity and kindness. The Moores were Presbyterian and very involved in their church. They maintained good contacts within the community. However, being a businessman, JB was not without his enemies. Our story truly begins on the 9th of June. The Moores had been preparing for what was going to be a very busy day. Their local church was holding an event known as Children's Day. This was an end of the school year / Sunday school event. As Sarah was one of the co-facilitators of the event, the entire family was planning to attend. The slate of activities for Children's Day lasted all afternoon, finally wrapping up around 9:30 p.m. after all of the day's activities were complete. Wanting some of the fun to continue, 2 of the neighborhood children, Ina and Lena Stillinger, asked their parents for permission to stay the night with the Moores. The 2 girls were granted permission and went home with the Moores to a dinner of milk and cookies. The walk home from their church was only about 3 blocks on a night that was remembered as cold, dark, and cloudy. Following their quick snack of milk and cookies, they all retired to bed for the evening. This was the last time the Moores were seen alive. At around 7 a.m. the next morning, the 10th of June, one of the Moores' neighbors, a woman by the name of Mary Peckham, became concerned about the family when she had not noticed them up and about the way they normally would be. The curtains were drawn, and many of the morning chores they normally took care of were not done. She went over to the home, let the Moores' chickens out, and went to knock on the door. She even tried shouting for them just to let them know she was there. When no answer came from within, she gave a call over to Josiah's brother Ross and asked him to drop by the home to check on his brother and his family. Ross would arrive to the Moores around 8 o'clock. He knocked and banged on the front door, and he grew concerned when he didn't receive a response. He was able to get into the home with a copy of a key that he had. He let himself in and began to have a look around downstairs. First, having a look into the downstairs bedroom, he discovered something that would shake him to the core. 2 blood-soaked bed sheets on the bed, and underneath, the bodies of their 2 guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger. Ross Moore immediately left the home and told Mrs. Peckham to call the marshal. She called over to Joe's hardware store and asked the employee, Ed Selly, to call for the marshal as something terrible had happened. Henry Horton, who went by the name as Hank, was the town marshal and arrived at the Moore home within the next half hour. Marshal Horton would conduct a search of the home and confirm that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls were bludgeoned to death. The weapon was a bloody axe that belonged to Josiah and was found in the guest room with the 2 girls. Marshal Horton also found 2 strange things at the scene. The first was a 4-pound slab of bacon and was left leaning up against the wall next to the axe. For the second, the killer had rummaged through every drawer in the home looking for articles to cover up every mirror and glass exit and entry point to the home. On the kitchen table, the killer left a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of bloody water. The news of what had happened to the Moores began to spread like wildfire. The scene drew over 100 onlookers, and a few law enforcement officers lost control of the scene. As so many people began to parade through the home, the National Guard had to be called in to cordon off the house. For Horton's part, he examined each room of the home. He discovered that each family member was covered over by bedclothes, and each of their heads had been beaten in about 20 to 30 times each with the blunt end of the axe. There were notable marks in some of the ceilings that showed puncture damage, likely from the upswing of the axe. This demonstrated just how powerful these swings truly were. Each victim in the house appears to have been asleep when the murders had taken place, with the exception of Lena. The 11-year-old was believed to have been the only person awake at the time, as she was the only one, owing to some marks, who attempted to fight off her attacker. She showed many defensive wounds on her arm, and the position on the bed in which she was found was laying lengthwise across it. A doctor by the name of F.S. Williams was called to come and examine the scene and its victims. It was his determination that the attacks had taken place somewhere between midnight and 5 a.m. Outside of her murder, Dr. Williams was able to confirm that Lena, who was found with her dress pushed up, was not the victim of sexual assault. He also made note that Josiah had been beaten worse than any other victim, with his face believed to have been bludgeoned to the point that his eyes were missing. It was also found that the blade end of the axe was only used on Josiah, while the remainder of the family received the blunt end. As Marshall Horton continued investigating the home, he found some other bizarre things at the scene. 2 cigarette butts were found in the attic to give rise to the belief that the murderer or murderers had waited out the hours in the attic, waiting for the right time to strike when members of the home were asleep. The murderer then made their way through the home by the light of an oil lamp, first targeting Josiah, and then Sarah, and then moving on to the children. Around 9 a.m., the county coroner, a man named Dr. Linkvist, arrived at the home. He had taken a look around the crime scene before meeting with Marshall Horton and the night watchman named Sheriff Orrin Jackson. The coroner's jury was convened at the Moores home for the full investigation. It would be several hours until they got started, and it wouldn't be until after 10 p.m. that Dr. Linkvist and the county attorney named Ratcliffe would give permission for the corpses to be removed from the home. The fire station was set up as a temporary morgue, and it wouldn't be until after 2 a.m. that the bodies were all finally removed from the home. The local newspaper shared a gruesome headline the following morning. Their heads were chopped open with an axe, a spectacle so repulsive that it was almost beyond comprehension. That 6 more victims murdered in identically the same fashion lay in the 2 bedrooms upstairs. As night set in on the 10th of June, the town of Villisca grew fearful that the madman was still on the loose. Neighbors would stand shotgun watch for one another to make sure that all windows were nailed shut and everyone was watched over. Over the next few days, every lock in the town of Villisca was sold out. Residents began open carrying weapons, and the rumors and suspicion between neighbors grew. Newspaper reporters and photographers began flocking to Villisca. It began a period of cooperation between local and state law enforcement agencies. On the 11th of June, the coroner's jury began an inquest into the happenings of the events, calling 14 witnesses to testify to their part in the process. The first witness to testify was Mrs. Peckham. She would state that she had gone to bed the night before, around 8 o'clock, so she didn't really notice the family when they got home. She heard nothing during the night, and after being out hanging wash in the morning. The next was Ed Selly, the employee of Josiah's at the hardware store that fetched the marshal. The key piece of testimony from Ed was that he mentioned Josiah had told him that he possibly had an enemy in one of his brothers-in-law named Sam Moyer, who wanted to get even with him. 12 more witnesses would be called to the stand, including the doctors and other onlookers that were present at the Moore house. The last witness, Charles Moore, Josiah's brother, testified that his brother kept an axe in the coal shed. As well, JB had a habit that he would lock the house every night from the inside before everyone went to bed. One of the earliest formulated theories about the events was that it was perpetrated by a serial killer. Within the previous year, back to 1911, across the Midwest, every 2 weeks, a family would be found killed in their beds with no motive present. These families were found in Colorado, Illinois, and just 4 days before Villisca, a family was murdered in Kansas under similar circumstances to the Moores. The idea of a serial killer was largely unsubstantiated and quickly faded from the public eye. On the 11th of June, large crowds were still gathered outside the crime scene at the Moores' home. Dr. Williams was credited with saying, "Don't go in there. You'll regret it to the last day of your life." Not heeding the warning, many people entered the home. The scene quickly became contaminated. However, due to the lack of advances in forensics at the time, finding any DNA evidence would have been near impossible. Unfortunately for Marshall Horton and his team, they had next to no leads. The town began to become suspicious of many people passing through, but the killer would have gotten a good head start on them and most certainly would have left town by that point. On the 12th of June, the townspeople gathered in the town square for the funeral of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls. National Guardsmen had to block off the street to allow the caravan to pass. Their caskets were not put on display during the ceremony, and they were finally laid to rest in Villisca Cemetery. Over the years, many suspects have emerged with respect to the killings. The first suspect was Reverend Lynn Kelly. It was said that Reverend Kelly boarded train number 5 westbound from Villisca at 5:19 a.m. the morning following the murders. As legend has it, he told a few of the travelers that there were 8 dead people back in Villisca who were killed in their beds and their bodies were not yet discovered. Reverend Kelly had only arrived in Villisca on Sunday for the performances at Children's Day and had been present for the performance of the 2 Stillinger girls. Kelly had been known to have suffered a mental breakdown in his youth, and from this is where he found his faith. He was assigned by the church as a traveling minister, preaching at various churches across the Midwest. He had developed a reputation for strange behavior. He had also been convicted of sending obscene material through the mail and had spent some time committed to a mental hospital. Kelly would return to Villisca 2 weeks after leaving and pose as a detective in order to get a chance to investigate the home. In 1917, Reverend Kelly was indicted on the murder of Lena Stillinger. In August of that year, he signed a confession attesting to the murder of the Moores and Stillingers, claiming that God had ordered him, "Suffer the children to come unto me." His first trial resulted in a hung jury, and it was believed that he signed the confession due to his history of mental illness. The second trial resulted in Reverend Kelly being acquitted and set free. What is important to know about the Villisca Axe murder case is that Reverend Kelly was and has been the only person to have ever been tried for these murders. Other suspects would begin to emerge as well. A transient worker named Andy Sawyer, who had gained employment with the local railroad the morning the murders were discovered, had bought a local newspaper and was described as showing great interest in the event. Now, Andy had a habit of sleeping with his clothes on and carrying an axe with him. He was turned over to the sheriff on the 18th of June by his foreman, Thomas Dyer. It was reported that at one point, a few of his coworkers had teased Sawyer, leading him to exclaim that he would cut their damn heads off. On another occasion, while riding through Villisca, Sawyer would tell Dyer's son, J.R., about the escape route the perpetrator took to get out of town. Sawyer, however, had an alibi, as he was arrested for vagrancy at 11 p.m. in Osceola, Iowa, on the same evening the murders had taken place. Other suspects would emerge as well. Harry Moore, of no relation to the Moore family, and a convicted serial killer, could have possibly murdered the family during his killing spree in the early 1900s. There was, however, little evidence tying Harry to the Villisca murders, so his suspicion quickly dissipated. Could it possibly have been Frank Jones? Josiah was a former employee of Jones's who left to open his own business in 1907, taking a great deal of business away from Jones in the process, including the business of a prized John Deere franchise. The word around Villisca was that because of this, Jones and Moore despised each other. Also, there was an unproven rumor that Moore was having an extramarital affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Two suspects possibly stand out from the rest in terms of plausibility. The first was a man by the name of Peter Mueller. Mueller was a young man from Germany who was the chief suspect in a manhunt for the 1897 murder of a family in Massachusetts, where he worked as a farmhand. Bill James and his daughter uncovered many news articles over the next decade in an attempt to solve the Villisca murders. They would uncover a killing spree that cost 59 people their lives over the span of 14 separate incidents. They tied together the murders in Colorado and Kansas and the fact that there are many similarities between those killings and the murders in Villisca. Each of these families lived near a railroad. They were all murdered around midnight or just thereafter, each executed by the blunt end of an axe left in plain sight, with bodies covered by sheets to prevent blood splatter, and the covering of mirrors and windows before they departed. Also, in many of the crimes that were being pinned on Mueller was that there were sometimes, but not always, a sexual motive towards a prepubescent girl. In Villisca, Lena was found partially disrobed. The Peter Mueller accusation is probably the most well-founded, but, like many others, has never been outrightly proven. The last suspect we'll explore is that of William Mansfield, as this theory was connected to Frank Jones. It can be believed that Frank Jones may have hired William, who often went by the name Blackie, to murder the family. One thing stands above the rest with this murder is how closely related it was to the previous murders in Colorado and Kansas. An investigation was opened against Mansfield in 1916, and he was subsequently arrested, but released later due to an alibi that he was in Illinois the night of the murders. Mansfield was identified by a restaurant owner named Mr. Thorpe in Shenandoah, Iowa, as a man he noticed boarding a train in Clarinda on the morning of the Villisca murders. Blackie told Mr. Thorpe that he had just walked from Villisca before boarding the train. If this was ever proven, it would have disproved Mansfield's alibi. Over the next few decades, many more witnesses would come forward with theories that were never proven. Many convicted felons would confess to the killings in Villisca, although none of their confessions really ever held weight, many due to the inaccuracy with the number of people. Over the next few decades, the home would go on to be owned by 8 more sets of people or companies and was eventually restored to how it looked back in the early 1900s. The house still stands today in Villisca, Iowa, and has been opened for tours, and as a museum, and can also be rented out for stays if there is anyone so brave to stay in the house overnight. It was purchased by its current owners, a Mr. and Mrs. Lin, in 1994. Having finished the renovations and restorations, it was added to the list of National Historic Places in 1998. With such a tragedy happening in that home, it certainly has had its fair share of paranormal occurrences. It has reached such a point of paranormal phenomena that it is constantly named as one of the top 10 most haunted places in the United States. Some of the phenomena is truly shocking. Previous inhabitants of the home have claimed to have woken in the middle of the night and noticed the shadow of a man holding an axe standing at the foot of their bed. There have been images of bloody shoe prints, closet doors that open and close on their own, and the sounds of children crying can be heard throughout the home. Clothing is often ripped from closets and dressers and is strewn about the home. One of the previous occupants also claims to have been sharpening a knife one day when the knife turned around and stabbed him in the thumb. He claims that something grabbed his wrist. Another family left the house in hysterics one night and subsequently moved out the next day. As the house has been open to tours, many paranormal investigations have been conducted on the home. During one of these, a TV crew recorded the voice of a man stating that he had killed 6 children in the home. Others have heard children's voices when none are present, banging sounds, and things that move of their own accord. Most of all, there have been reports of feelings of pure evil when investigating the attic, where it is believed that the killer waited before the murders. During one of these investigations, someone attempted to enter the attic, but was prevented from doing so by something unseen. In 2009, a paranormal investigator came to Villisca to make contact with any spirit still remaining in the house. When he entered Lena and Ina's room, he asked them to turn his flashlight on and off if they were still there. They did so every time that he asked, causing him to proclaim that he believed the spirits of the murdered family were still in the home. One of the caretakers of the home, a man by the name of Johnny Hauser, had an experience in the home that chilled him to the bone, which emanated from the kitchen. He was in the kids' room upstairs, having previously locked the kitchen door, and heard someone walk into the house. He was almost positive that it was simply someone trespassing, so he decided to pull a prank on them that would scare them out of the home. He hid in one of the children's closets and waited for the individual. He listened to them come up the stairs and into the room he was waiting in. Johnny burst out of the closet and screamed, but there was nothing there. When he saw nothing, he could only feel as what he described as having the wind knocked out of him. Investigators from the show Kindred Spirits investigated the house and believed that the killer also remained there. When they asked, "Did you do something to this family?" they received a response through EVP of, "I killed them." A medium had also connected with the spirit, who seemed giddy about what he was going to do. His favorite type of person was one who was weak and could be easily manipulated, like putty in his hands. On a night in 2014, Johnny Hauser went to meet with one of the evening's guests, an older man in his 50s and his elderly parents. Hauser noticed that the man wore a large hunting knife on his belt. He checked the people in and then left for the evening. The next morning, Hauser heard that the man who was staying in the house alone was stabbed through his chest with the knife on his belt in a downstairs bedroom. He laid in a pool of his own blood until he was discovered. It was determined that the wounds were self-inflicted, and he would go on to survive the ordeal. The victim would return to the home a few years later, and when asked if he could explain the events of the night of the stabbing, he said that he entered the room with the intention of provoking the spirits, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up in the emergency room. Many of the homes in the area of the Villisca Axe House have modernized. However, the Moores home remains frozen in 1912. The home still has no electricity, and much like the night of the murders, the curtains are drawn at all times. The home is now a popular attraction for those looking to visit and possibly conduct investigations of their own. It even still houses the same furniture and beds the family were slain in. The Villisca Axe Murders remain one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in America and will likely remain that way for the rest of time. The Moore family have possibly long since departed the residence, but if any of the reported occurrences are truly to be believed, it's quite possible that the ghost of whomever committed these atrocities never left. One thing about the Villisca Axe Murders is that there is still no clear motive. There was no evidence of sexual assault or any evidence of robbery. No items were taken from the home and nothing reported missing, and Josiah's pants that were draped over the end of the bed still had cash, checks, and keys in the pockets, meaning unless there was anything glaringly obvious, the killer entered the home for the sole purpose of murdering the Moore family, and by association that night, the two Stillinger girls. Another major question is, in such a small house, how did the murderer commit 8 separate killings without waking up a single other member of the house? In Martha Lynn's words, "I don't know if the murderer is still here, but there are things that have happened here that aren't exactly calming." The Villisca Axe Murders remain an unsolved case, one of the most famous cold cases in American history. Now, over a century removed, we can only speculate as to what happened on that Sunday night in 1912. One thing is for certain, that the spirits of some of the 8 people slain that night still remain in the home, and one is left to wonder if they're still haunted by their killer, or if such unspeakable evil was done that night, if the home is not stalked by something far more insidious. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of our story, and, unlike the Moores and Stillingers, survived the Villisca Axe Murders. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed our story. Please feel free to visit our Linktree and leave us a rating or a review of what you thought of this episode. Remember to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any of the episodes to come. Please be a friend and tell a friend about the Insidious Agenda podcast. If you would like to show your support, donations can be made to our PayPal account in the Linktree. So please come back next week as we explore the story of the wickedest man in the world, Aleister Crowley. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.